Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today I'm finally checking out Intel's new Skylake-X CPUs. For those of you unaware, during the Computex 2017 trade show, which took place earlier this month, Intel announced their upcoming Core X series, comprising of not 3 CPUs, not 4, but rather 9, the biggest range of high-end desktop processors Intel has ever announced. So why has Intel gone from 4 CPUs with Broadwell-E covering the 6, 8 and 10 core variants to 9 CPUs covering anywhere from 4 to 18 cores? The answer is simple. After years without competition, Intel finally has some, and some serious competition at that. AMD's Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 5 CPUs have already mixed things up quite a bit and put Intel's more mainstream offerings under fire. AMD then put Intel on notice when they announced the upcoming high-end desktop series dubbed Threadripper, which would offer up to a massive 16-core 32-thread part, and it's expected to cost considerably less than Intel's 10-core Broadwell-E CPU. Speaking of Broadwell-E, the sting from that series is still fresh in my mind. The 10-core 6950X came in at an insane $1,700 US, while the 8-core 6900K wasn't much better at $1,050 US. Those seeking a 6-core Intel CPU had to cough up at least $430 for the 6800K, but in doing so saw a pretty hefty downgrade in PCIe lanes from 40 to just 28. As it stood, AMD's Ryzen 7 series was making a mockery of Broadwell-E, so Intel needed to combat the situation sooner rather than later, and with an even more serious threat on the horizon, they decided to act and rush out Skylake-X. The question being, in a world where the Ryzen 7 1700 exists for just $310, can Intel get away charging roughly twice that for their 8-core CPU? This is exactly what they plan to do with the Core i7-7820X. Higher up the food chain, we have the Core i9-7900X, the cheapest of the new Core i9 CPUs, and at just $1,000, it's the cheapest 10-core CPU we've ever seen from Intel, but is it cheap enough? Their new 6-core Core i7-7800X model has dropped down to a slightly more affordable $390 US, but that still prices it well above the 8-core Ryzen 7 1700. Intel's also going to release a pair of quad-core parts based on the Skylake-X architecture in what is an utterly baffling move. Those parts will be the Core i7-7740X and the Core i5-7640X. For this review though, I won't be looking at these models, we'll save them for a future feature. Thus far I've mentioned 5 of the 9 new Intel Core X CPUs, the other 4 being the 12, 14, 16 and 18 core models, though they won't be available on June 26th. Rather, Intel suggests they will be released much later in the year. Anyway, for this video, I'm not going to go too heavily into the details on the new processors or Intel's new architecture. We've sort of already gone over the specifications and information released at Computex, and since we are quite late to the party here, all this information has been released by other sources. So for now, we're focused on the lower core count Skylake-X chips, the Core i9-7900X, Core i7-7820X, and Core i7-7800X. Here we can see how each of the 3 new CPUs compare, and apart from the core count and of course price, the key thing to note here are the available PCIe lanes. For the full 44 lanes, consumers must invest no less than $1,000. Meanwhile, the $600 and $390 parts offer only 28 lanes, the same amount as last season's 6800K. If we compare the Core i9-7900X to the previous generation 10-core part, it looks very impressive. You get the same core and thread count while paying a little over 40% less. You also get a few more PCIe lanes and of course an upgraded CPU architecture. Then when compared to 2014's flagship Core i7-5960X, you get more cores and a higher operating frequency for the same price. Of course, as I mentioned, a lot has changed in the last 3 months, and as a result, the CPU landscape looks very different, and with the arrival of AMD's Threadripper just around the corner, things are set to change even more. As I said, Threadripper will pack up to 16 cores and 32 threads, and is expected to cost no more than the Core i9-7900X. That said, official pricing information is yet to be released. What we do know is that the Threadripper platform will offer an incredible 64 PCIe lanes, while the CPUs will pack a mammoth 32 megabytes of level 3 cache. Although we can't compare the new Skylake-X CPUs to Threadripper, we can see how they compare to AMD's existing Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 5 parts, so let's do that. Previously with Broadwell-E processors such as the 6950X and 6900K, we were stuck at a memory speed of about 2666. The Skylake-X models happily accepted the 3600 extreme memory profile of our G.Skill Trident Z RGB 32GB memory kit. That said though, we decided to test at 3200, and we thought this was probably a better memory speed until we test how many memory modules, X299 motherboards, and Core X CPUs can hit this frequency. Anyway, running the memory at DDR4 3200 resulted in a massive bandwidth of 63GB per second for the Core i9-7900X. The 6-core 7800X also achieved roughly 60GB of throughput as well. This means the 7800X enjoyed around an 18% boost in memory bandwidth compared to the previous generation 10-core 6950X. AMD's Ryzen 7 series impressed in the Cinebench R15 multi-threaded test, and as you can see, the 8-core CPU puts down the 6950X with relative ease. In fact, the 1800X isn't a great deal slower than the 10-core 6950X, largely thanks to greater operating frequencies. However, the Core i7-7820 and its higher clock speeds make up for this and are able to roughly match the 6950X while offering almost a 20% boost over the 6900K. The 6-core 7800X also outscores the Ryzen 5 1600X and beats it comfortably for the single-thread test as well. Then finally we have the big daddy, the Core i9-7900X, and its amazing score of 2,201 points, making it by far the most powerful desktop CPU we've ever tested. The single thread result is also very impressive, matching the 7700K. Those wanting to compress and decompress archives in a hurry, take notice because again, there's no desktop CPU as fast as the Core i9-7900X, at least at the moment. The 7900X was 17% faster than the 6950X in this test, while it was also 19% faster than the Ryzen 7 1800X when decompressing. When it comes to compression, the Ryzen CPUs aren't really that efficient, and as a result, the 7900X was 65% faster in this test. The 6950X has always been a beast in our Excel test, taking just 2 seconds to complete the workload. This isn't a memory sensitive test, so all that extra bandwidth doesn't really help the 7900X pull miles ahead. That said, it still offers an 8% performance increase. Meanwhile, the 7820X matched the Ryzen 7 1800X, while the higher clock 7800X managed to match the 6900K. The PCMark 10 Essentials benchmarks aren't really designed to take advantage of core-heavy CPUs, rather they simulate common, everyday ways people use their PC. The workloads from this test that we're looking at cover web browsing and video conferencing. As you can see, the 7700K and its superior out-of-the-box clock speeds make it the best for web browsing tasks. That said, thanks to single and dual core performance of the 7800X, it still does a very good job here, as do the other Skylake-X CPUs. The video conferencing test is a bit more core heavy, and as a result, the 7800X does pull ahead of the 7700K by an 8% margin. That said, it is only able to match the Ryzen 7 1800X. The productivity test group measures system performance with everyday office applications, namely looking at spreadsheets and writing workloads. Again, these aren't tasks that take advantage of workstation class hardware, so quad-core such as the Core i5-7600K still do very well here. The digital content creation test group reflects the demands of working with digital content and media. The tests include photo editing, rendering and visualization, as well as video editing. This graph shows the performance of the first two test groups. A following graph will look at video editing performance. As expected, the Core i9-7900X does very well in these tests, outscoring the Ryzen 7 1800X by a 33% margin for the rendering test, though it was only 2% faster for the photo editing test, which does use fewer cores. Lastly, we have the PCMark 10 video editing results, and again, editing typically doesn't tax the CPU that much, and few editing applications do a good job of utilizing more than a few cores. We certainly see that here, as the 7700K was by far the fastest CPU tested. The Core i9-7900X did do well here though, but it wasn't that much faster than the 1800X. Corona comes as a standalone benchmark. It renders a fixed scene 6 times, and we report the time it takes to complete the task. This application does love threads, so the more the merrier, and the quicker you'll be done and you can move on to something else. As you can see, the Core i9-7900X took just 97 seconds, which is less than half the time it took the Core i7-7700K. It's also a 34% improvement over the 1800X. Meanwhile, the 7820X roughly matched the 6950X, while the 7800X was slower than the 6900K, but it did edge out the Ryzen 5 1600. Blender is a popular application. It's often used for benchmarking CPU performance for both AMD and Intel. The open source software is free to download, and I've used version 2.78. And for the workload, I've used AMD's Ryzen render file. So yeah, the new Intel CPUs are rendering Ryzen CPUs. Anyway, the Core i9-7900X didn't seem to waste any time pondering the implications, as it got the job done in a blistering fast 18 seconds. Meanwhile, the Core i7-7820X took 21.5 seconds, and the 7800X was done in 26 seconds. Overall, very strong performance from the new Intel CPUs. For our HandBrake test, we take a 4K high-quality video file and convert it from H.264 down to 1080p using HEVC, also known as H.265. The numbers you're seeing here in the graph show how many frames per second each CPU was able to transcode the video at. The Core i9-7900X is a beast, managing 30.7 frames per second, making it 31% faster than the 6950X and 51% faster than the Ryzen 7 1800X. The higher clock speed of the 7800X really helps here, though the added memory bandwidth is equally important. Even the 7820X is able to pull ahead of the 6950X, beating it by a 9% margin. Remember, this is an Intel 8-core part versus their previous generation 10-core part, so mighty impressive stuff. Meanwhile, the 6-core 7800X is able to virtually match the 6950X. Right, so this is the test I care most about, as I spend quite a bit of time each day rendering videos. So the CPU that can save me the most time here is generally the one I'd go with. For example, the PC used to render this video packs a Core i7-6950X, and I had planned to probably replace it with Threadripper soon. That said, the current version of Premiere Pro CC isn't that good at taking advantage of high core count CPUs, and as a result, the 7950X is just 4% faster than the 6950X, so that's a bit of a disappointing result. The benchmark is CUDA accelerated by a GTX 1080 Ti, so keep that in mind. That said though, there aren't a huge amount of effects in my videos for the GPU to accelerate. Okay, so I get these aren't gaming focused CPUs, but if I skipped over the games entirely, I can't imagine that would go down too well with many of you. So I have picked 4 CPU intensive games that I think do a good job of utilizing as many cores as pretty much any game does these days. That said, most are best handled by a 6-core 12-thread CPU. Battlefield 1, for example, still hits the highest frame rates on the Core i7-7700K. Still, for a core-heavy CPU, the 7800X does a very good job, as does the 7820X and 7800X. Mafia III was one of the few games that really took advantage of the Ryzen CPUs when they were first released, allowing AMD to enjoy strong gains over the 7700K in this title. However, the game was quickly patched to become less CPU intensive. Perhaps better optimized is the word. I'm not really sure, but the direct result was lower CPU utilization while achieving slightly better frame rates. Here we see that the game still favours the higher clock 7700K, but also still requires more than 4 threads, as the 7600K is quite a long way down our graph. Hitman is a surprisingly CPU demanding title. Please note I've tested using DirectX 11 to avoid any issues NVIDIA GPUs seem to have with Ryzen when using DirectX 12, though I haven't revisited this recently. Anyway, the Skylake-X CPUs perform very well, though again it's the 7700K that's the fastest option here. Finally, we have Ash's The Singularity, the only game that can really take advantage of a 10-core CPU, though at this point it's more of a synthetic benchmark than an actual game anyone plays. Still, it does give us an idea of what future games might require, though how far away that future is anyone's guess. Up until now, the new Skylake-X processors have looked mighty impressive. And now, they're starting to look mighty power hungry. The 6-core 7800X sucks down the same 193 watts as the Ryzen 7 1800X. I was hoping it would be closer to the 1600X if I'm honest. Still though, the 7800X isn't really the issue here. Both the 8-core and 10-core models are considerably more power hungry. Both push system consumption over 200 watts, and that's significantly more than what the 6950X system consumed. 226 watts is a huge amount of power draw in the Excel test, so let's move on to see what the power consumption figures were like for Cinebench R15. Okay, so these numbers are even worse. Quite a bit worse. The reason for this being that the Cinebench R15 test is not just more intensive, but it also runs for quite a bit longer, so the chips heat up more and consume even more power. For this test, the 7800X was sucking down almost 260 watts, whereas the 6850X hit just 212 watts. Clearly those higher clock speeds come at a real cost. Although our coverage is late, we still haven't had that much time to play around with the new Core X CPUs, just a few days in fact. So I'm yet to spend much time overclocking. In fact, I've really only briefly taken a bit of a look with the 7800X. The results were mixed. My chip only managed a stable 4.6 GHz overclock. No matter how much voltage I threw at it, I just couldn't stabilize anything higher. The system would boot into Windows, but it would end up blue screening within a few moments of running any kind of stress test. Stability might improve in future BIOS updates, or perhaps I just have a bit of a dud CPU. Looking around the internet, it seems most are stuck at 4.6 GHz like I am, but others have managed to stabilize their system at 4.7 or 4.8 GHz. However, the frequency isn't my greatest concern right now. Using just 1.2 volts, which is all I needed for a stable 4.6 GHz overclock on all cores, the system consumption went from 259 watts, which I already deemed quite high, to an insane 402 watts. And yet, that might not actually be the worst part. The deal breaker is probably the operating temps. Cooling the 7900X was the Corsair H100i V2, and despite being a premium 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler, temps skyrocketed the second the CPU was placed under any kind of load, hitting 90 degrees almost right off the bat, before climbing further towards 100 degrees. So unless you have an amazing cooler, I'm not sure overclocking is really going to be worth it. Moving on from overclocking, before I jump to the conclusion, let's try and put the results just seen into perspective. First up, let's take a look at the price versus performance scatterplot for the Cinebench R15 multi-threaded results. So ideally, for all the price versus performance graphs that I'm about to show you, what you want to see is the CPU as far right as possible and as low as possible. The further right, the better the performance. The lower on the graph, the cheaper the price. As you can see, the Ryzen 7 1800X is rather far right and still quite low. It is quite a bit better than the Core i7-7800X in terms of value, and remember the 1800X itself isn't particularly good value, sitting next to the Ryzen 7 1700, which sadly I didn't have time to add, but I will for future videos. Obviously, when compared to the 6950X, the new 7900X is a massive step forward in terms of value, offering much greater performance at a much better price. Moving to the Blender results, we again see that the Ryzen 7 1800X and Core i7-7800X are quite similar in terms of value, though again the pesky R7 1700 will mess things up for Intel here. Anyway, looking just at Intel's lineup, we see that the 7900X is again a huge leap forwards. Priced alongside the 6900K, it offers significantly better performance in this application. The Core i9-7900X proved to be a seriously significant upgrade over Broadwell-E in our HandBrake test. For the same money, Intel fans are essentially getting a 50% boost in performance, and I believe the increased memory bandwidth really helps here. This is something I will look into soon. Meanwhile, the Ryzen 7 1800X finds itself situated between the 7800X and the 7820X in terms of price and performance. The Corona price versus performance figures look particularly impressive for the Ryzen 5 1600X, as it sneaks in just behind the Core i7-7800X at a much lower price. Meanwhile, the 1800X is much closer to the 7820X, while again coming in at a lower price. For 7-zip, I have only looked at the decompression results, and AMD does much better here when compared to the compression testing. That said, I feel most of you do significantly more decompression work than compression. As you can see, for decompression work, the 1800X is a lot better value than the Core i7 1800X and 7820X processors. Looking at the PCMark rendering and visualization figures, we see that the Core i9-7900X is a massive upgrade over what Intel was previously offering. That said, for less than half the price, the Ryzen 7 1800X isn't that much slower, and in terms of value, it also gives the 7820X and 7800X a hard time. Lastly, we have the Premiere Pro CC results, and here the scatterplot looks quite a bit different to those seen previously, as this application doesn't really do a good job of utilizing those high core count CPUs. Even so, the 7900X does still offer a decent increase in value over the 6900K. Right, so we've taken a pretty good look at the new Core i9-7900X, the Core i7-7820X, and the Core i7-7800X, so the 10-core, 8-core, and 6-core parts. We'll have to wait a bit later in the year before we can check out the more expensive 12, 14, 16, and 18-core models, so for now, let's not worry about them. So, what do I make of these new Skylake-X parts? Okay, well, firstly, I think they are mighty impressive in terms of performance, and I think we can probably all agree on that. As it stands, the Core i9-7900 blows the socks off everything right now, and the 7820 does a good job of making the previous generation 8-core CPU look a little sluggish. The single and dual thread performance is also very impressive, roughly on par with the best quad-core CPUs Intel has on offer. The only hiccup here is power consumption. The Skylake-X parts consume between 20 to 40% more power than the equivalent Broadwell-E parts, so that's pretty brutal. Although I haven't delved too deep into the overclocking side of things just yet, it's fair to say based on what I've seen so far that the massive increase in power consumption doesn't bode well for overclocking. Your typical go-to all-in-one liquid coolers aren't really cutting it. A serious do-it-yourself solution will be required. Okay, so performance is good, power consumption is scary. What about the price? Well, compared to Broadwell-E, the pricing is a lot less scary. Bang for your buck, Skylake-X offers considerably more. We've gone from a $1,700 US asking price for Intel's 10-core desktop CPU to $1,000. And with that, you're getting a much faster processor, albeit a hotter and hungrier one. The Core i9-7900X is still a seriously expensive CPU, there's no denying that, but with no real competition when looking purely at it from a performance perspective, Intel probably can get away with charging what they are, at least for now. Threadripper will likely change that in the near future, but that's a story for another day. Let's talk 8-core CPUs for a minute. The Ryzen 7 1800X costs $406 US right now, but smart shoppers will opt for the much cheaper $310 1700 model, which can be overclocked to achieve the same performance. The Core i7-7820X, on the other hand, comes in at a reasonable $600 US, making it 30% more expensive than the 1800X, but almost twice the price of the 1700. Looking at the Cinebench R15 multi-threaded performance, the 7820X is around 30% more powerful than the 1800X, so the price seems justified, at least over that chip. However, moving to real-world applications, the 7820X was only like 10% faster overall, so in terms of performance, there really isn't that much in it. The 7820X does have the advantage of 28 PCI Express lanes to just 16 lanes for the Ryzen 7 CPUs. The limited PCIe lanes of Ryzen is something Threadripper will address in a rather big way shortly, but if you need the extra PCI Express lanes, then the 7820 becomes the more obvious option for now. Basically though, if you do care about value at all, Ryzen 7 is the obvious option, as a decent X370 board starts at about $110 US, making the CPU and motherboard combo just $420 US if you intelligently opt for the i7-1700. Meanwhile, the 7820X and the cheapest X299 motherboard will set you back about $830 US. Again, basically twice the price for nowhere near twice the performance in any application. Meanwhile, the 6-core 7800X roughly matches the 1800X in terms of performance, though they do trade blows depending on the application. Still, if you throw the i7-1700 into the mix, even Intel's most affordable Skylake-X CPU is a tough sell. That said, even if money was no object, that'd be nice, I'd still have a tough time picking between the AMD Ryzen 7 CPUs and the new 6-core and 8-core Skylake-X CPUs. The Core i9-7900X is a little clearer cut, at least for now. So yeah, if money really is no object, then the 7900X is the way to go. The performance is exceptional. You get loads of PCIe lanes, overclocking is an option, at least to a degree, many degrees in fact, and the X299 platform is superior to AMD's X370. However, even if Threadripper wasn't incoming, if you look at this from a value perspective, the 7900X still makes no sense in a world where the Ryzen 7 CPUs exist. That being the case, as impressive as the performance of the 7900X is, I don't recommend buying into Intel's latest platform, at least not right now. My advice is hold out, see what AMD has to offer, and then go from there. Intel may very well have to adjust pricing. That's going to do it for this one. There's still plenty more testing to be done, and I do have those Skylake-X CPUs to confuse the heck out of me as well, so that should be fun. I'm your host, Steve. See you again soon, guys.